This is session number 41 in the Worlds of Speculative Fiction series, and this is somebody who I wasn't originally going to do, but we always, every year now, it's become a tradition, we put some of the slots to a vote, and interestingly, there were a lot of people who wanted to talk about Bram Stoker as speculative fiction, and it really does fit in there well. I had not, I'd myself seen plenty of Dracula movies and variants on that, but hadn't read Dracula. I'd also seen the crazy movie Lair of the White Worm that some of you may have seen.
Which is not at all connected to Lair of the
Well,
White Worm.
it's tangentially connected. And the Lair, and then reading the Lair of the White Worm, that is also a pretty crazy novel as well. It's quite a thing that we'll talk about. And, I had a chance to read a few other of Stoker's things, and so it was quite good. We were talking before we began. I was able to get my hands on this Essential Stoker, edited by Leonard Wolfe, who I'm assuming is the person who did all the extensive footnotes, some of which are quite interesting and helpful, many of which are quite opinionated.
I found this almost as interesting as the story, actually.
Oh, the footnotes? Yeah, it's a good...
So there's a lot of them.
It's a good book when the footnotes are really good. So I think that during this one, what we typically do in these sessions is we talk about the life and biography of the person a bit, and then there's a lot of emphasis on the world building that they're doing. It's worlds of speculative fiction, so we think of, to the extent that we can, about what the world that's created in the narrative is like, and there's a pretty rich narrative universe in Stoker, I'd say. And then we talk about philosophical themes within the literature, and usually we get off track on different points, but that's quite all right. I always have some philosophical themes picked out to talk about. Usually people participating have some that they'll point out. Quite often, some of the people who have read more of the writer than I have. We'll see if that's the case with Stoker. I'm willing to bet that some of you have read Dracula more times than I have as well. So, no further ado, let's jump in and talk about where this guy came from and what he was doing. He had really an interesting life. I hadn't checked out his biography before researching it for this, but he's Irish, born in Dublin, and apparently suffered from some disease. Nobody knows what it was. He just alludes to it, but he was so sickly as a child that he had to be carried around much of the time. He was nobody quite knows exactly what was wrong with him. But when he goes to school, when he's 7 years old, suddenly the illness is gone like that. So it might have been something environmental, or maybe it was, there was something weird psychological going on. They were kind of coddling him too much. But one thing that he does tell us is that because he was so homebound, he got to hear lots and lots of stories. And many of these were what we would nowadays call, not just folk tales, but horror stories. Folk tales about the horrific ghosts and other worldly beings that can do terrible things to you. I don't know, maybe they told him that, better not go too far, they'll get you, or things like that. But then he has this transformation. He goes to school and he suddenly becomes quite healthy and eventually becomes very fit, becomes quite an athlete. And some people have speculated about what could be going on with this, and they said, well, maybe there was some vampirism going on or blood transfusion, but probably not. It would have been pretty primitive at that time. We're talking about the 1850s, so I don't think so. But there are stories of people who start out as sickly children, and then through calisthenics and sort of rough living outdoors.
Teddy Roosevelt.
Well, Teddy Roosevelt is one. Julius Caesar is another one. Apparently was asthmatic. There were a couple others in antiquity, similar kinds of stories. So, maybe situated the right way, the human body can recover from these sorts of things. And maybe if you're coddled too much as a child, that plays a role. In any case, he's got a fairly uneventful childhood other than that, and then he goes to Trinity College Dublin, so stays in town. He will do things in that area for quite a while. He becomes such an athlete that he wins prizes for weightlifting and the 5 and 7 mile walks. So and from what they said in his stories about him, he was more of a jock than he was an intellectual when he was in college. So that made him quite popular, and he had a good time. But he does get interested in the University Philosophy Society. He eventually becomes secretary, and when you become secretary of a club, that's often like the first rung of the leadership position. Secretary, treasurer, vice president, president, right? So the next year he becomes the president of the University Philosophy Society, which still exists, and they have a Bram Stoker club, because he's probably one of the most famous people who went to their school. And that organization started in 2011. They hold weekly afternoon paper readings on all sorts of topics. And it's one of those societies where that was part of what you did. And when he became president of the society, he had to read a paper. A lot of these societies would do that. You get together, you read a paper, talk about the paper, then eat and drink and do whatever you're going to do after that. He was also the auditor of the College Historical Society. Graduates eventually, and when he does graduate, he doesn't dissociate from the college. He's still pretty actively involved. But he also begins working in the civil service at Dublin Castle. So he's doing everything in the same town and enjoys himself quite a bit. He claims that he graduated with a degree in pure mathematics. The people who research this say that there's no possibility that he did that he misremembered something or is making something up. But it's an interesting notion. Eventually, he actually purchases an MA from the college, which is a way to add. Purchases, made a donation. Things were not as rigorous as they are now in any respect, right? And then he winds up in the civil service thing. He becomes this inspector of courts of petty sessions. What that means is he has to go around and check up on the courts and make sure that things are going the way they're supposed to in the courts. Now, think about our courthouses, right? Every once in a while you get a judge who wants to do their own thing, and if it's out in the countryside, they might actually get away with it. But now we have social media and fairly rigorous reporting. Officers like this were needed to make sure that justice actually got done in a regular way. So he's going around, and he actually will later on write a book about that. The Duties of Clerks of Petty Sessions in Ireland. It's one of his first early works. Eventually, he meets this guy, Henry Irving, and Irving is going to be really important in his story because Irving is a major actor. By this time, Bram Stoker has been doing some literary work, reviews. A common thing to do at the time was review plays or novels. As a matter of fact, if you want to get started as a writer, even today, one way to do it is to write reviews for something that'll get you attention, like the local paper or a blog or something like that. Instead of writing something yourself, you've already got somebody else who's done the creative work, and then you just say whether it was good or bad, or what you thought was good about it, and what you thought was nonsensical. So he reviews Irving's Hamlet, which is playing over in Ireland at the time, and Irving had been a really big name actor, and he's going to assume a really important role in British acting by taking on a theater. So he meets Irving, and they have dinner, and they become friends. And friends is kind of a maybe a misnomer a bit. Quite a few people think that Irving is the inspiration for Dracula in some respect. He was incredibly charismatic, kind of a jerk, well, actually not kind of a jerk, manipulative, and Stoker really liked the guy. It's not clear that Irving really liked Stoker except as somebody who would, provide him with adulation and perks and do work for him and things like that. So in any case, in 1878, he marries this actress, Florence Balcombe, and they move to London, but they move to London so that Stoker can become the business manager of Irving's Lyceum Theatre. And the Lyceum had, it had fallen on hard times. Then Irving came there. He was best known at first for this 150 performance run of a play called The Bells that I know nothing about because I don't think too many people play it anymore, but apparently it was quite popular. And Irving was known as being somebody who could really portray stuff, who could change things up. And I looked at the stuff that they actually did play while Irving was the main lead in the Lyceum. About half of it is Shakespearean, about half of it is more contemporary plays. Some of it adaptations of books or things like that. So that seems to be what the theater fare at that time was. And, it would always be Irving in the lead position and then whoever else he had around him. And Stoker, is the business manager. So that means that he's got to do all the accounts. He handles all of the touring around. He gets very familiar with train schedules. And this is a theater that actually does go from place to place in Europe and in America. He has his one son, Irving Noel Thornley Stoker, born in 1879. And in the 1880s, he tours America with Irving's theater, and he meets Theodore Roosevelt. So, two sickly guys become very robust, meeting each other. He also meets William McKinley, and he meets one of his idols, Walt Whitman. He talks about Whitman in some of his correspondence. He was really quite taken with him. As a matter of fact, he brings him up in an essay that had to do with censorship, and that was published in the 19th century, sort of general review. He wrote a real interesting essay on that. And he wrote a little bit about the U.S., this glimpse of America, this is a common thing for people traveling around to do at that time. You go somewhere, you take some notes, you produce a book, you sell the book, and everybody knows a little bit more about the place that you're going, provided you haven't made up some of the stuff or, misinterpreted what was going on. So then he a little bit later on, he's visiting Whitby in England, and that's, part of the setting for Dracula. And he begins working on and researching for Dracula. At first, I think it's supposed to be called The Undead, and there's a lot of interesting, backstory about what went on. Apparently, there's not just Dracula's guest, the first part of the manuscript missing, which we do have. It got published as a story after his death, but about 100 pages of manuscript missing. That was supposed to be early on in it, and nobody knows what happened to it exactly. We also know that he did quite a bit of research for the story. Not a lot of research into Central South European history, as it turns out, but a lot of research into all sorts of other things. And you see it, you see it reflected in some of the characters, perhaps, like Van Helsing, who knows so much about all these different things and can apply all these different forms of hypnosis, and he certainly was quite interested in what at that time they called alienism. Nowadays we call it the study of mental health or psychology, abnormal psychology. Right? Renfield is an example of that. In 1893, he begins traveling to another location, Cruden Bay. He starts taking vacations there. He sets some of his other books there. And you notice he's already starting to write other novels. The Snake's Pass, The Water's Moo, which is lots and lots of dialect. He liked doing dialect writing. Not quite so much fun for us to read, I think, unless you're into that sort of thing, because you have to try to figure out how does this actually sound. And there's a good bit of that in Dracula, too. Like anytime there's a lower class character, they always have a dialect, don't they? And actually Van Helsing has his own weird way of saying everything. I don't know if it does reflect how Dutch people talked at the time, but they're clearly, it's something. And these other books weren't really that successful, but they were getting him attention. He's also writing other short stories and things like that along the way. And then Dracula comes out in 1897. And I have something that's actually, the dates are wrong on one of these things. Oscar Wilde, I should mention this. Oscar Wilde had been a friend of Stoker for quite a while, in part because Wilde was very interested in the woman that Stoker would eventually marry. She'd been involved with Wilde, and they're all connected together. Wilde gets convicted in 1895 of engaging in homosexual acts and gets sent to do hard labor. Doesn't take well to it. It damages him in body and mind. So by the time that he's released in 1897, he's in pretty rough shape. Stoker now is starting to write more and more stuff. Nothing ever comes close to Dracula in terms of either popular acclaim or quality. I think it's safe to say. He writes, Miss Betty, The Mystery of the Sea, The Jewel of Seven Stars, and he's playing around with themes in interesting ways in these, like some of the same ideas, like the liberated woman and what should happen with that, or other occult phenomena and how we should make sense out of those. Eventually, the Lyceum Theater starts running into problems. It looks like Irving might have actually blamed some of these on Stoker as well, which not very nice, because from all accounts, Irving was a rough guy to deal with. Stoker would try to do everything he could to make life easier for him. Stoker's very devoted to Irving, and when Irving dies, Stoker writes a kind of hagiographic book about him, and he's really deeply upset. One critic actually said that Irving may have been the only real love relationship that Stoker had in his life, which that might be going a little far, but there's probably something to that. He seemed to have been attracted to these at least somebody who was very domineering and sometimes mistreated him, I guess you could say. So eventually the Lyceum is put into receivership. Stoker has to leave. At this point, he's kind of scrambling for where's the money going to come from. He still has a kid, a wife, and he starts writing a lot more. That's one way to do it, right? Become a full-time writer. There's some of the more interesting pieces come out of that. He writes this personal reminiscences of Henry Irving. That would sell well. He's a famous actor. Those sorts of things do well in our time. Then he writes Lady Athlin, which is another novel. Writes Snowbound, the record of a theatrical touring party. Sort of this is what it's like getting caught in the snow. In a certain way, it's sort of like a mini Decameron. You're familiar with the Decameron? It's a book. This is a thing that's been done to death at this point. You have like a bunch of people and put them somewhere, and they don't have a lot to do. In the case of the Decameron, they're going up to get away from the plague in Italy, so they're up in the mountains. And now what do? Well, to while the time away, each of us shall tell a story, right? So each one tells a different kind of story, and it's a way to put a book together that doesn't have to have any sort of thematic unity or overarching plot. It's just a bunch of stories, and you put them in the mouth of this person said this and this person. So that's essentially what Snowbound is. Then we have The Lady of the Shroud. One of the interesting books that I did want to check out. I looked at the just the table of contents of it. Famous Imposters. And again, you think, well, why did he write a book like that? Because it would sell. It's the sort of like when I was young, there was this Ripley's Believe It or Not that would come out every so often, and most of it was probably made up nonsense with some facts thrown in and some of it inflated, but they would sell like hotcakes. There was even a TV show for a while hosted by Jack Palance. Ripley's Believe It or Not.
And it was in the Sunday comics every Sunday.
That's right. Yeah. Was that in the Journal, or was it only in the Chicago Tribune though?
I grew up in St. Louis. It was in the
Oh,
St. Louis
okay.
Post-Dispatch.
I think I remember reading it in the Tribune because my grandpa would get the Tribune, but it wasn't in the Journal. Although it might have been in the Sentinel. Back then we had more papers.
It was around for a while.
It was in the Green Bay Press Gazette.
Oh, was it? Okay.
Yeah.
That's right. You're from Green Bay. I forgot about that.
By way of.
Yeah.
They weren't born there, but I ended up there.
And then, so the last one he writes is Lair of the White Worm. And who here has read The Lair of the White Worm?
Couldn't get my hands
Okay,
on it.
so
Couldn't find
what
it.
did you think?
Honestly, I was a teenager at the time, and
okay.
I just read Dracula and looking for anything else by Bram Stoker. I had a lot of trouble making sense of it, to be honest.
Well, it's mesmerism.
I heard it was.
That's what many of the critics said too. And they were people who were being paid to make sense of these things. Lovecraft, H.P. Lovecraft, said it was one of the worst books he's ever written. And I did read it for this, and it was really cool. Here's my impressions. There's a lot going on in it, and much of what's going on doesn't really map on that well to the other stuff that's going on. It's almost like Stoker had maybe 3 novels worth of stuff, and he's like, I got to find some way to make this all fit together, and it does all fit into one book, but it's not a coherent narrative, and it's not because he was doing anything experimental with like unreliable narrators or the stuff that people do today to be clever or fancy. You wonder what the hell was he thinking in writing this, and it's kind of it's a fun story. There's a lot of cool scenes in it. You've got this woman who in some way is clearly snake related, and he intimates that she's actually the white worm, but it's not clear how she could shrink down to human size and do that. And mongooses attack her and this guy has mongooses, right? Mongeese. There happens to be a supply store that has them handy out in the countryside, and one of them is even like a super mongoose that has killed king cobras in India before. So there's that whole story going on, and then there's this other story about the heir coming back from abroad, and he's the one who he doesn't actually use mesmerism. There's this battle of wills taking place within it, and there's a lot of like domination, attempts to dominate the other person through your will, and there's even like gestures that you make to make it happen. And what's that?
Just saying that you're still talking about the same.
The Lair of the White Worm,
The
yeah.
White Worm, yeah.
And there's more to it as well, And so there's at one point there's an infestation of birds across the countryside. So this guy sends up this massive kite way into the air that somehow the birds think that is a bird of prey. And then, he wants to do experiments with lightning, and that eventually leads to the conclusion where lightning strikes the kite, blows up the lair of the white worm, and everybody's good at that point, I guess. But it's quite a story. And the movie, of course, we were talking about this. The movie has almost nothing to do with the book, It's there is a white worm, but there is a woman.
There is a woman who's the white worm.
Who is snake-like, there is the notion that it's tied somehow to like ancestral Roman, pagan rituals and stuff like that. But there's very little other.
No monkeys.
There's
There's suggestion that she's immortal.
Yeah.
In the movie.
Well, no, and the book, the worm is practically immortal, and there's a lot of theorizing by Stoker about how beasts from the antediluvian age would be able to survive on in rare instances and adapt themselves so that they would continue on into our modern scientific present. And
How much do you think that ties into Loch Ness?
That's what I was thinking.
Because he grew up in Ireland.
well, Loch Ness is in Scotland.
But he spent time in Scotland on vacation.
Later on, yeah.
Later on.
And it is the last book that he wrote.
And you have to wonder, with the white worm and the reptile in Loch Ness.
We lived there,
You know.
I was there.
Well, this is happening
And the
though down in,
suggestion-
this is like down in England though.
I know, but I mean, you have to wonder.
Was there an idea
speculation
from it?
with-
Yeah.
Did
I
he get some
suppose.
inspiration from that legend?
Maybe.
That story.
Yeah. I mean, he has a story that actually is set in Scotland in that Dracula's Guest and Other Stories that was released by his wife after he died.
Because Loch Ness ties into antediluvian creatures and
Yeah,
continue to
true.
live on.
Yeah, and all sorts of theorizing about it. That makes
You have
sense.
to wonder if he was inspired by some of that.
Could be. I mean, he's setting out a sort of a larger theory about like how this could be the case like across the world. In that. So this is actually a good part to move into the world building, right? What is the world of Stoker's stories like? Clearly, it's one in which modern progress has taken place, at least in some places, like the British and their empire. This story could not have taken place because it's all done in telegraphs and what are supposed to be typewritten copies of people's diaries and letters and things like that. It couldn't possibly occur without a network of communications that we know is typically modern happening. People are like constantly, mailing for this and that. Dracula himself has Harker mail off some letters saying everything's okay here. Don't wait up for me. Basically, don't worry about me. And has them posted. So there's that going on, right? And they're able to do a lot of quite interesting things in that respect. And yet it's also a world in which horrible beings have managed to survive through the centuries and could come to threaten that very new world order. And who knows what's lurking in all the little areas. And some, it's mummies that are going to come back to life, Egyptian empresses, and there's all sorts of bogeymen that can come out, and so and Stoker likes to see if you can possibly connect this with science as he understood it in his time in any way. So hypnotism or mesmerism plays a role in a lot of this. He's got theories expressed about what might be going on with Count Dracula, how he survives through the years, and yet he'll have all sorts of other things that are like they strike you as almost like the rankest superstition, where you take a little bit of the host and the wafer and you put it around. You've got a circle that'll keep a vampire in there. They research whatever literature they can find about how you kill these vampires, and it's similar with all the other books, including Lair of the White Worm. What do you do when you've got a giant worm that every once in a while comes out and wreaks havoc? Well, you adopt a mechanical thing. Bring in a bunch of sand and pour that down the wormhole, and then drop some dynamite in there, and that'll take care of the problem for you. So there's this weird mix, right? And the world is a foreign world to us because it's the world of the late 19th and the early 20th century, and it's a weird 18th and late 19th and 20th century, right? It's one in which Gothic horror can not just take place, but perhaps you might say be the norm, be the governing principles for things. I mean, the rest of you who've read Dracula, what else would you say about the world that he's building here, in terms of the narrative universe that we're in?
Well, it's interesting because it feels like such a gaslight Gothic horror to us, but it's something that somebody had brought up is like for its time it would have been received as kind of almost like a modern techno thriller.
Because
you had like cutting edge technology, blood transfusions,
that's
things
true,
being recorded on photographic cylinders and things like that. It would have, I think,
new technology
for its time had a bit more of that kind of like fast-paced, almost like sort of a Tom Clancy aspect to it of people using like a modern technology again, like you were saying with the epistolary aspect and letters back and forth and solicitors doing business and everything like that. I think it would have felt a lot more to the people who were reading it at the time like this kind of something from this old world encountering like cutting edge technology.
Do you think that like the blood transfusion thing, when I was reading that, I was like, boy, that was really iffy. What if the blood types didn't match?
You hemolyze and they die.
Right. Well, and so
blood types then.
Well, so that's what I was thinking is Stoker treating this cutting edge technology the way that sometimes sci-fi authors do? Think about like what everybody was doing with the internet back in the 90s and the movies that came out about it. That now we look at and we're like, wow, that was really awful. How far off base were they about that? Is Stoker doing something like that?
I would say absolutely, yeah.
Okay.
I feel like in how in film CPR always works. It's sort
That,
of like
true.
glossing over some of the medical difficulties for the sake of a good story.
No one ever seems to crack any ribs when doing it.
No, they
don't.
Yeah.
There's the exact right spot.
Over and over and over again, Van Helsing is supposed to be one of the most like accredited doctors on the planet. We'll make these scientific pronunciations that make no sense at all.
Yeah.
I would say very much so. Again, in the way of like a lot of like modern techno thrillers where people, yes, they've hacked all our nets. Our nets have been hacked. It does feel that way.
Okay.
I would say.
So what else can we say about this world that we've got? Some of it does occur in Eastern Europe that Stoker never experienced himself, as far as we know.
Some of it strikes me as a friction between ancient world and modern world.
Yeah, that's definitely true.
Because Dracula is definitely ancient.
Yeah.
All of his beliefs and all of the things that he grew up with, or lived through.
Though, that's one of the themes that I'd wanted to
brings the very
bring
ancient
up.
into.
So that's right, and there is definitely a contrast that's drawn in there about that, and they talk about his Van Helsing talks about it in terms of his child's brain, that he's not fully developed the way that we English people are, who have mature brains, and that gives them an advantage in that they can do philosophy. In the sense of like reasoning out causes and effects, which there's a couple interesting examples of that where Van Helsing has Seward, and he's like, okay, so you observe this, what follows from that? And it's basically like they're doing logic puzzles, right? And then they also talk about their ability to combine in a way that the vampires can't. But they're also concerned with the fact that this undead curse could now that Dracula's in London, because London is effectively the center of the world, the communication network. If Dracula can get a foothold there, then he can spread this vampirism all over the world. And they also hint that what we want to do is nip this in the bud before he can start to truly understand what a great threat he poses. That his child's brain is now starting to like work and realize that he could in fact become mature, and then who knows? Maybe they take over all of the world.
And Dracula asks Harker a bunch of these pointed, really ominous questions about.
That's true.
Could I
yeah.
have a whole bunch of different solicitors doing different things so no one would know exactly what I'm up to?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So that's he's figuring things out, and Van Helsing realizes that that's why this one vampire is so troublesome.
Well, that's a very Anglo-centric.
Yeah.
England, the empire, British Empire, is better than everything else.
Yeah, gonna say.
And Eastern European people are just children.
Even French.
Even French,
Yeah.
they're all just these neophytes.
Talking of this, the
They're all
fictional
the
Lovecraft,
Slovaks.
it's middle class
That's what they're
England,
calling them there.
writ
Yeah.
large, writ cosmically, sort of.
Yeah, some people talk about Dracula as being. I'm trying to remember the name of it. It's something Imperial Genre, and the idea is that the empire itself is being threatened by forces that could undermine it, and that would be basically the end of everything, except for maybe the Americans would. Stoker did have a lot of hopes for the Americans, in part because he was so happy that the Irish people were over here. And many of them didn't just stay in Boston or places like that. They became cowboys. A lot of the people that we think of as the Western heroes, they would be English or Scots or Irish or whatever. Some of them were former Confederates too, and they would just happen to be out there. And so you've got that one character who is that archetype, who of course has to die in the end, giving his life, in a heroic way. The kid gets named after him. I forget what was his name. Quincy. That's right. Yeah, Quincy.
They had Winchester rifles, which came very handy.
That's right. Yeah. So again, modern technology is going to overcome these.
Peters,
Yeah. That'll take care of those wolves for them. But the idea is that the Empire can't fully understand the threats posed to it. It's been too successful in a way, So I don't remember the name of the genre, but apparently there's a genre of literature that gets that's the defining trait of it. Well, what other things really came home to you in this? I have some other themes that I'll bring up, but what else?
Well, Stoker does that perfect example of there's an example, and it's become a cliche now, but that Alfred Hitchcock gave of how to do suspense, where you have people talk about baseball for 10 minutes and then a bomb goes off. You have 10 minutes of boredom followed by 10 seconds of shock. But then show the conversation again and show the viewer the bomb under the table, and this conversation, which should be banal, now contains suspense.
Yeah.
And Stoker starts off his novel, with Dracula's castle and Jonathan Harker going through this ordeal, so the monster's out there. And so then through all these sort of somewhat kind of banal epistolary bits that come after this, these people are just going about living their lives, and then there are little things going on in the background, but the monster's coming.
Yeah.
And so it's sort of seeping slowly like smoke into the background, while all these people are just going about, Lucy Weston Russ getting married, and Mina's, going about her. You have this sense of something building behind the scenes.
Yeah, and Seward, especially his diaries, what's going on with Weird Renfield.
And of course, because of how it connects to what you've seen, but for everyone else, it's this slow dawning sense that something's wrong.
And when it comes to the foreground stuff, maybe we'll wrap up this
Yeah.
topic first. But I just think, a lot of his later novels were actually romances or romances crossed with suspense, and you can kind of see some of that, especially in the Lucy chapters. He does have a flair for writing characters who are in love with each other or who love each other. There's a really strong bond between the entire heroic group.
That's true. Yeah. And there's another interesting bond as well. So this is told through multiple points of view, and it is called an epistolary novel, but it's not an epistolary novel in the same way that some others are, because there's so many different genres of reported speech, you could say, right? There's telegrams, there's reports, there's diary entries.
Newspapers even.
That's right, newspaper clippings. letters, all these sorts of things. And there's one passage that I wanted to highlight, and I shouldn't dog your books, but I did. And this is in Dr. Seward's diary, and it's talking about how Mina Harker she's got a typewriter, so she's typing everybody's stuff out, right? And here we go. So he says, I was so absorbed in that wonderful diary of Jonathan Harker and that other of his wife, I'd let time run on without thinking. Mrs. Harker was not down when the maid came running to announce dinner, so I said she's possibly tired, let dinner wait an hour, and I went on with my work. I just finished Mrs. Harker's diary when she came in. She looked sweetly pretty, but very sad. Her eyes were flushed with crying. This somehow moved me very much. Of late I have cause for tears, God knows, but the relief of them was denied me, and now the sight of those sweet eyes, brightened with recent tears, went straight to my heart. So I said as gently as I could, I greatly fear I have distressed you. Oh no, not distressed me, she replied, but I have been more touched than I can say by your grief. That is a wonderful machine, but it is cruelly true. It told me in its very tones of the anguish of your heart, it was like a soul crying out to Almighty God. And then she says, no one must hear them spoken ever again. See, I have tried to be useful. I've copied out the words on my typewriter, and none other need now hear your heartbeat as I did. None ever need ever know. No one need ever know, shall ever know, I said in a low voice. She laid her hand on mine and said very gravely, but they must. Must. But why, I asked. Because it is part of the terrible story, a part of poor dear Lucy's death and all that led to it. Because in the struggle which we have before us to rid the earth of this terrible monster, we must have all of the knowledge and all the help that we can get. I think that the cylinders which you gave me contained more than you intended me to know, but I can see that there are in your record many lights to this dark mystery. You will let me help, will you not? I know it all up to a certain point, and I see already, though your diary only took me up to 7 December, how poor Lucy was beset and how her terrible doom was being wrought out. So some of the stuff that you were just talking about. Professor Van Helsing saw us, or Jonathan and I have been working day and night since Professor Van Helsing saw us. He's gone to Whitby to get me more information. Now, here's the clincher. We need to have no secrets among us. Working together and with absolute trust, we can be stronger than if some of us were in the dark. And so what she's doing is she's assembling the story. At the very end, there's this, we don't have the original document, so I don't know if anyone will really believe this. But Mina is the one who's putting this all together, and they're putting it together because it's an intelligence report so that they can kill the beast, so that they can take on the enemy. So it's both serving the purpose of putting together this wonderful story. Now they all actually are on the same page, literally, understanding how to do things. None of them are in the dark. They're reading each other's things precisely because she can take the shorthand and type it out. And they can read each other's things and say, holy crap, there was a vampire. Why didn't I realize this, And now they can all kill it together, including her who's affected with vampirism. So I think that you could say that's a philosophical theme. These perspectives being woven into a story, and that being dramatically depicted in the very story itself. Pretty ingenious when you think about it. For Stoker to arrange things that way, I don't think he hit on that just by chance.
The way he portrays vampirism too, though, is also on another level is almost like a disease.
Yeah.
She's afflicted with vampirism.
Yeah, and she's going to get worse and worse and start to lose sight of herself and become cruel. Her eyes will get
process.
hard. Yeah.
It's almost a disease process.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you can, I suppose, your amount of will would affect it one way or the other, but once you've consumed the vampire's blood, which is how it happens in this case, you're kind of screwed. There's not much you can do other than get rid of that vampire. Just like in all the movies that we see with the vampires, kill the one super vampire, and they all
either die or they're cured.
Yeah,
One
or
of the
turn to
two.
dust, or yeah,
You
yeah.
know what I was kind of thinking because I've seen like you all the different
Yeah,
iterations
yeah.
of the movie, but I've never read the book. So I tried to put myself back into that time frame, never having seen anything, and then reading this. And it was, like you said, it was really kind of like a horror thriller. I mean, it was that Victorian Gothic horror, and then you have to think of Victorian times, all that repression and everything.
Yeah.
And this was very seductive. Dracula is a seductive character. He is. Even with his, blood-sucking kind of nonsense, and just no, but I mean, it's a seduction. The way he comes in, and it is.
That's true. He doesn't just come out and bite you.
No.
Yeah. Yeah.
But again, contrasting that with the time of the Victorian, all that repression and everything that went on at the time, and then just like I said, when Harker sees him just crawling down the wall, and he's kind of
upside down.
Yeah, and the cape is flapping out, and
Yeah.
and he's like, I probably think, oh shit, I mean,
Yeah.
what is this? He's had this harrowing experience getting there. He's already thinking something's up, and then he sees this, and then all of this, stuff that's taking place. If I had not known any of these other things, reading this at that time would have been really, really frightening.
Some of the critics actually said, like, don't let kids take a look at this book, or don't read it in the dark, or things like that.
Well, there's some, for the time, very racy elements to it too.
Oh yeah.
With those three women, like
Exactly.
in the basement,
and
yeah.
Harker talking about his sort of being of two minds at the same time when they're talking about feasting on his blood, where he can't wait for them to do it, even though he's also terrified and knows that something monstrous is happening, and sort of is talking about his own essentially lust for this thing to happen.
Right, but they're looking at these women and their beautiful lips and their fair skin, and he just goes on and on and on, and they're all coming for him, and he's how does he say, he's not like, I'm a man. I mean, it's something like that. I can't resist what's going on here, but for putting myself into the times, I thought, wow, this would have been really
Racy.
something. Well, not just racy. I mean,
Yeah.
really, just frightening.
So the experience of reading it would have been quite affecting.
Well, I mean, that whole Carpathian
Yeah.
era was all full of stories and tales. I mean, that I know from my history. I mean, it was nothing but werewolves and vampires. I mean, that was the tales were told all the time. So he really picked up on that.
Well, do you think he was influenced by Jack the Ripper? I mean, did anybody else read that? That's what I like. Was jumping out at me. I'm like,
Was
that
the
was
Ripper
the
was
late?
later.
That was
There-
18
Ripper was later.
The Ripper was later.
Well, I thought that was like 1880.
1888.
Yeah.
88.
Oh,
There is a
okay.
connection
Okay.
in that.
This was 1897.
Oh, yeah, then what was
that?
He was
Was
doing
it?
all his research.
Yeah.
In 1890.
Yeah.
And Jack the Ripper.
Yeah.
I mean, a lot
Well,
of the
Jack the
similar...
Ripper's a different kind of. There were a lot of things being written by English people in that era that gave us sort of the repertoire of weird or horror characters, like Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde is around the same time, and Dorian Gray, the Oscar Wilde's piece, and
Hadn't there been like a Penny Dreadful novel, Varney the Vampire, that had come out?
Yes,
Varney,
yes.
Varney.
And
Yeah.
Carmilla.
That's right.
what's that?
Carmilla, the female vampire. By
That one I don't know. That was around the same time? Or?
She was a bit earlier.
Okay.
Maybe they got something in the annotation.
Yeah, I mean, the idea of blood-sucking beasts, that are walking in human flesh is it's not a really new one. And you find it in all these different cultures, that are not connected with each other.
I haven't read the annotated version. Has anyone said like why specifically? Because if you listen to or if you read what Dracula says to Harker, early on, when they're meeting, it's implied that he actually is Vlad the Third, like the who ruled in that area. Is there any particular reason why Stoker chose that historical personage for
I think
this?
he didn't do a lot of research about
Yeah.
it. They actually can't think much about the historical Vlad Tepes in his notes.
That's it.
I
Yeah.
think the guess is that he looked at Transylvania. That sounded scary. And
Well,
there was a lot of
the
myth
character
in there.
in this is he says at one point stuff about himself, attributing it to his ancestor, and then it's Van Helsing who says, that he must have been this and that the character that he was at one time was very courageous and fought against the Turks and was very very intelligent and studied alchemy and stuff like that. And so the idea, seems to be like somehow he came upon something that allowed him to become this, Not that he was this always at the start, but this is like sort of like, this is going to help me fight the Turks better, or something along those lines. What's that?
The Scallamance, the Devil's School. It's a Transylvania folk tale about like the devil takes 7 students, someone gets sacrificed.
I don't think that's in this at all.
Okay.
Is it?
It might be, because there was a sort of Dracula fan conversation going on, and someone had brought it up that this is actually, the Scallamance is pretty rarely known outside of Transylvania, except among Dracula fans.
Oh, interesting.
The mention of it.
Well, it shows up. That legend shows up in later, more recent.
That machine would
Probably
be buried
shows
alive.
up
You
in
could
the
turn it
Sergeant
around.
Oh,
and
yeah.
People know that you
Yeah, exactly.
Don't call it
Yeah,
that.
there were things like that,
But
not
it's
just in
that
England,
principle,
but
7
there was a
are
big
chosen,
fear.
and one is
People
chosen
did.
to become the next.
Yeah.
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 One of the things I find interesting, I was just thinking is, because I read a fair amount of vampire literature.
That's right,
I
yeah,
have
yeah.
over the years. And more contemporary vampire
Anne Rice,
literature. Well, Anne Rice and Chelsea Quinn Yarborough,
Okay.
and there's some others.
Yeah.
The more contemporary vampires, Discovery of Witches by Deborah Harkness, they're far more intelligent and far more urbane.
Than the human beings who
Then they're treated more as another race,
That's true, yeah.
less a monster,
Yeah.
and they're seen as monsters by people outside, but as characters.
And that happens too in the vampire movies
They're
and
treated
TV
as-
shows.
They're treated as
Yeah.
another creature, another.
There was that one that was
creation.
it was airing for quite a long time. True Blood, right?
True Blood. Yes.
There they are like a whole different like society, right?
Their own society.
Anne Rice's stuff, they were a society essentially,
Yeah,
right?
in the Vampire Chronicles, they're basically their own society.
I guess in Buffy the Vampire Slayer they were as well, though that's more or less from the side of let's get rid of these things, and there was all sorts of other stuff mixed in there as well.
But not everybody wanted to get rid of it.
Yeah.
Buffy.
Yeah.
But
Well,
it-
yeah,
but
she fell in love with one for a while, right?
But it's a shift from
Yeah.
these are terrible monsters.
These are a
something's
plague.
gone wrong with them. They're a plague.
You know,
to some people see them as a plague.
a show
but
that
maybe there's some other thing going on here in terms of them being a creature of their own, a species.
yeah.
There's even a little bit of that in Elizabeth Costova's The Historian, which is
Mhm.
kind of a retelling of like if that actual Vlad the Third had survived into modern day, where it's almost treated as a kind of a secret society, like
Okay.
people who are in on some kind of secret.
There was
Well,
a
there were Harknesses.
there was a British
Discovery
show.
Witches, there's some of that in there.
There was a British show. I think it might have been called Ultraviolet or something. It was a typical British show, like 6 episodes run, and it came out in the early 2000s. Same sort of story, like vampires, versus humans, and they're they're their own thing, and let's not wipe them out. But then, of course, it turns out they're bad, and they are trying to take over. One that I thought was actually quite interesting and successful in doing let's draw this out in suspense. That's a recent show. I don't know if any of you have seen it. Was The Strain. Have any of you seen that one?
I didn't see that one.
I did. I
So
saw that.
I think it had about 4 seasons, sorry, and it starts out fairly slow. Vampirism is transmitted through these worms that like get into people and make people immortal, but also kind of deform them. And it's really a parasite that lives in you, takes over the body, and they're portrayed for a while as why are you persecuting us? That sort of thing.
Well, long term, that's Anne Rice's theory.
Yeah.
Is a parasite.
Oh, is it?
I
Yeah.
thought it was a spirit of some kind.
It's a spirit of some kind, but it's also treated like a viral
parasitical?
parasite.
Okay.
Okay.
It way into her series.
Okay.
Yeah.
There's talk about it being a parasitic, spiritual or viral kind of thing.
And I guess in this, there's really never any real explanation about what vampirism is or what the underlying condition is. It's just a symptomology. Your teeth get longer, your eyes get hard. Pretty soon, you don't like the sun anymore. You start eating dirt. But a lot of compensating things. You can control the elements. be a bat, be a wolf. What else could he be?
Live forever.
Rat.
Yeah, rat. Yeah, could be a mist. Yeah. Live forever. Although that live forever thing, that's another interesting theme that doesn't really get treated in this, but does get treated in some of the other literature.
In Saint Germain, it gets treated in the Chelsea Queen Yarborough.
Yeah, I mean, how do you not get bored out of your? I mean, it also comes up. So somebody put down Roger Zelazny. We did the Chronicles of Amber, and that's one where you've got immortals, and they are presented with the same problem of, what do? You're going to live forever unless somebody stabs you, and.
Well, in the Chelsea Queen Yarborough books, the Saint Germain books, what she deals with eventually is technology.
Okay.
For generations, for centuries, he can get by changing his name and becoming his own descendant.
Oh.
And then all of a sudden now we have
facial recognition
and DNA and fingerprints and airlines and things.
Jig is up, huh?
It's like how do I hide? And he's in one of the later stories, short stories. He's dealing with now how do I hide?
That's an interesting one.
How do I change? And he comes up with this in one of the stories. I think it was set in World War II, around the time of World War II. He comes up with this these dummies that look like him.
Okay.
That he can get killed off in a bombing or something, and he can change.
That's a smart way to deal with
but
it.
But as technology changes and there's fingerprints and what have you, he's struggling with. How do I not get detected? How do I not get discovered in this new world that he's dealing with?
It's a good thing, I was just thinking with the Highlander movies, if you remember those from the first one. It's a good thing that it happened in the 80s or 90s? Yeah, because they didn't have that technology back then, But now I suppose, they were moving into a very different time.
And Rice deals with it too. Anne Rice in her later
does she?
starts
Okay.
dealing with it.
Yeah, I've only read the first. What was it? The first book, Interview with a Vampire. Yeah, that's
it gets
much more complex, right?
much more complex.
Yeah.
Yeah.
One of the other things that I thought would be kind of interesting to talk about in this, that's a theme that comes up here, is they're doing things that they know are illegal. And they're doing it to save civilization. There's a couple places where they're like, we can't tell the cops this because they won't understand what's happening. So there's a sort of like vigilantism for civilization. And for Victorian era characters, this is a moral quandary, right? Stoker actually writes in the piece about censorship that I was talking about there being, legal laws, and then there are moral laws, and the moral laws take priority over the legal laws, and yet they are laws. They apply. They're even more rigorous. And so you've got these characters that are doing things like Van Helsing. Is doing things that are essentially sacrilegious. He says at one point, "I have a dispensation," and then the person who did the annotation is like, "That's not the way these things work." No, he says, "I have an indulgence," and they're like, "That's not what indulgences actually mean." You wouldn't get permission to take a consecrated host and crumble it up, put it around door frames or stuff like that. That just doesn't work that way, But Stoker, he's like, Van Helsing can do that. And they have a conversation about the propriety of doing these extra legal things. And they come to the conclusion, essentially along, I guess, utilitarian lines, that this is the right thing for us to do, It would just slow us down to try to explain this to a judge But they do worry about it quite a bit. And so I thought that was quite interesting.
And I feel like the way Stoker really makes that work is that all of his protagonists who band together to fight Dracula are all extremely morally upright
Yes,
people.
yes. Yeah, there's no slouch
no
in
moral
there.
gray areas, and no one's trying to profit on the side somehow from this, or is like the sort of person who might do something out of cruelty. They're all very certain in their morality, and they're all
that was
very...
pretty typical of Victorian literature.
Yeah.
Oh, very much so. But it's what
time.
makes it okay when they make these decisions to act outside the law. It's like, that these are, or at least you're told over and over again that these are people who, if they make a moral decision, it's going to be the right one.
Yeah.
One of the commentaries I read suggested that there was a homosexual theme within Dracula. I didn't see it, but they suggested that there's a lot of speculation that Stoker was actually homosexual.
So I think
driven to wild. And,
I think that those are like two different issues that we could deal with separately. It does look like it doesn't look like Stoker had any interest in homosexual activity, but he did have very strong friendships that certainly seem to be erotic in some sense, And interestingly, when Wilde was convicted and he spoke for himself at his trial, he thought he was going to help himself out. He actually got them totally against him. He was bringing up, in Plato's time, there were these, read the Symposium, there are these beautiful relationships, and they're not sexual at all between men, and they're, they understand that men can be lovers, and all they heard there was
lovers.
This is, yeah, exactly. And I think that, arguably, you look at the people who Stoker was really into, Wilde, Whitman, and this guy Irving. Now, Irving was pretty. He looked like he was pretty heterosexual. He had a leading lady that he'd put in all his plays, and it looks like he may have married somebody to be what we nowadays call a beard.
Who could have been bi?
And then he came out very strongly about he wanted every homosexual
at the very end,
author to be jailed.
Yeah, at the very end.
Well, that sounds like some repression there.
Yes, it does.
So that's probably
that was the
Maybe he
speculation.
felt that,
Yeah.
So that's probably the case.
Laundry, right.
The question then is, are there any of these elements in Dracula?
In Dracula.
I don't see it either.
I didn't see it.
I think you'd have to deliberately read it in ways that would be not in a sexual way, but in a literary way, perverse to find it in there. But I might be wrong. I don't know.
Well, I don't think in a sexual sense there's any of that in Dracula.
Yeah.
And maybe this is more of the convention of the time, but I do notice how often and to what extent all of the characters in Dracula, all the protagonists, tell each other how much they love and respect one another and how close they feel to one another.
That's true. And
they
they also complement each other quite a bit for their manliness.
There is this aspect of not eros, but agape between everybody. All of our protagonists really seem to love and respect one another. And like you said, we'll complement each other's manliness or uprightness or in a way that you just don't see in modern literature.
I think that's the time. That's how they spoke.
Lucy is also an erotic object in there who manages to bring the men together, right? Mm-hmm. Because you've got the two failed suitors, and then the one who actually does get to marry her, right? They all give their blood to... There's actually that scene, too, where they're the one guy is saying, well, I consider us married because I gave my blood, so, I tried to help you out and all that. And then, was it Van Helsing who brings it up?
Seward and Van Helsing are both cowering in the back because they know they did the same thing.
Yeah, they're
Godalming was the one, and then Quincy Morris also did.
Well, because earlier in the book, Lucy had says, why can't a girl just marry 3 men?
That's right. That's right. I forgot about that. Yeah. And so, in effect, maybe she does, right? Does Van Helsing give his blood? I don't think he does. Does he?
I think he does at one point, in desperation.
Okay.
Because both Seward and Van Helsing do at one point, and Seward actually says something along the lines, and maybe this is kind of like that competition for Lucy's affection, because he says something along the lines of well, you took a lot more blood from Arthur Holmwood, when he was giving blood, and Van Helsing says, well, he was her husband and you're not, or something along
That's
those lines.
right. Yeah. So, I mean, does that tie in with anything having to do with homosexuality, or is it just sort of a surrogate for
it doesn't feel like
heterosexual?
I don't think so.
It just feels like, again, another
part of the
sense
story.
of this bond between all of these
isn't it
characters.
just kind of like a non-sexual marriage between Lucy and her suitors? They're being bound literally by blood.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like this exchange of fluid, and they seem to consider it sort of a consummation of marriage because they speak of themselves as married afterwards, which sort of seems to fit with what we hear about Stoker's marriage with his wife, which was not completely chaste. They did have a child, not super effusive.
Yeah, it's not quite what you would call a mariage blanche, which means an unconsummated marriage. That was kind of a popular thing for quite a few people. But they probably, the consummation was probably like, well, got to do your duty.
That's what you do. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Because otherwise, they
Well, remember, it
probably.
was
I mean,
Tolkien.
clearly they were fertile. So if they wanted more kids, they would have had more kids. It doesn't say any babies were stillborn or anything like that. So maybe once they had one child, that was all that they thought needed. I don't really know that much about his wife, frankly, whether she was happy or not or anything like that.
Well, they never wrote much about women during that point in history.
Well, I don't know. I mean, it depended on the woman.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There were quite a few, and actresses were already sort of on the weird end of society anyway. They weren't they hadn't been given the legitimacy that they now have in our times when it's actually more social currency to be an actress. Back then, you were kind of disreputable still. It wasn't like as bad as it was, say, in the Middle Ages or the Renaissance, but they still weren't completely accepted in society. One other thing I did want to bring up, too, is Stoker, Stoker studied philosophy, and he does have his characters talk like philosophers at quite a few points. I mentioned the, let's run through the problem, step by step by step. He is, sort of like what goes on with Arthur Conan Doyle and Sherlock Holmes. There are these long processes of inference, and they're actually, I don't find them boring to read myself, or so I listen to it on tape as well. I don't find them boring to do that, but I teach philosophy for a living. So I was kind of curious, those of you who read through those passages, were you like, I got to skip ahead? Or were you like, oh, this is an integral part of the unfolding of the plot? Because in movies, they don't do that anymore. They let's skip ahead, That guy's a vampire, We don't have these long, laborious chains of inference going on.
Well, what was kind of interesting is when Renfrew was a philosopher.
That's true.
When he got his bout of lucidity, and
That's right.
He started going on this whole philosophical treatise, and the guys are all looking at him like, whoa. I mean, that was a huge passage of what he went on and on.
Yeah.
And that is not the character that you'd ever see in the movies, like the spider-eating weirdo that's climbing the walls. This character in here, the original character, was much more rich. I mean, he had a whole lot more going for him.
He was a tragic figure in many ways.
He was absolutely a tragic figure, but there's a big passage in there where he's going through this philosophical, treatise, and
do you mean where he's talking about life and how you have to consume it and that sort of thing?
That, but other things too, because the guys are all there, the little crew is there, and they're like, whoa, what's this, and then they started to engage more philosophically, and then Seward was engaging philosophically with him.
If you think about the vampire movies, Renfield is generally turned into this sort of caricature.
Yeah, he's just a comic. He's just a spider-eating, climb the walls kind of guy, and he was. I mean, he had his moments where he had to be straitjacket, when the master was near and stuff. But
Van Helsing types keep showing up in movies, right? The sort of sage vampire hunter who knows the answers. Again, like in The Strain, he was the old guy in The Strain who fights the vampires. Played by the same guy, the same actor who played the Frey patriarch in the Game of Thrones thing. It was kind of weird to see him as a good guy.
Well, he was also in Harry Potter. He was
that's true.
The janitor, basically.
He was the caretaker. But I mean, we definitely have Renfield characters. We definitely have Van Helsing characters. I guess you could say that we do have Quincy characters, the sort of tough guy, who's going to kill the vampires in a lot of vampire movies. Sometimes it just reduces to that. There's no Van Helsing. There's just, some tough guy doing that. Do we have the other types of characters?
Don't have a lot of Mina. Even in Dracula adaptations, she tends to be reduced either to damsel in distress, or they make her some sort of badass who knows kung fu.
In which case, she's not Mina. She's actually Quincy, right?
Yeah, they don't have a lot of room for program for the woman who knows shorthand and thinks to collect the stories and gather evidence.
yeah.
And stuff.
There's a great example of that, and this is kind of tangentially related.
Yeah.
If you've ever read any of the, Alan Moore wrote a comic book called The League of Extraordinary Gentlemen.
Yeah.
Which is
Yeah.
like a concordance of various
Heroes.
novels and stories, and the head of the group is Mina. Well, she'd been divorced and become Mina Murray again. In the comics, in the comics, she's just a very resourceful, very forthright, intelligent person who can like bring everyone together. But then when they had to make a movie out of it, they decided, well,
Drop her out.
She's got to be they
No,
put
she's
her
in it.
but they
Was
made
she
her,
in?
They made her like
Yeah.
half a vampire, so now she can do all the cool Dracula stuff and,
Oh, okay.
and basically do the kung fu like you
They
were
made her a
saying.
superhero.
I guess I don't
Yes.
remember that movie that well.
It was terrible.
It was a
I
terrible
didn't
movie.
see anything at all.
It's a terrible movie.
I
Sean
remember
Connery
it
in
was
it.
funny.
Yeah.
The gentleman who gave
But
you
yeah, they made her a superhero, a vampire
also Lori
superhero.
Yeah.
was a brunette.
Yeah,
Okay.
she was basically like I don't know if she was supposed to be half vampire or whatever, but it wasn't enough for her to just be a resourceful person who
Yeah.
could bring people. She had to have powers
Okay.
for the film. So that's a perfect example.
Yeah, and do we have anybody who's like Seward in contemporary vampire movies?
Penny Dreadful actually had a character who was literally Seward, but she was a female alienist who was helping the protagonist.
That's right, yeah.
It was an interesting
I
idea.
don't remember much about that
Well, like
character,
much
though.
with Penny Dreadful, it was more concept than execution.
Yeah. Yeah, that's true. We watched our way through that, but we were not particularly impressed. There were so many points where we were
That's how
like,
it started, but-
well, there were so many points where we were like, that should have been written like this, because then they could have done this, and they sort of wrote themselves into boxes. I think.
Although Vampire Dude is kind of an interesting take on Quincy. Ethan, literally the cowboy who's also a vampire
Yes.
and shoots some wolves in his opening scene. And he really is like a what if Quincy Morris, but will make him a bit more
Affected, yeah. Okay. You know, that was another thing too. Is that I think if I remember, this book has like a listing of all the different Dracula movies. Yeah, it does. All the different adaptations of it. So many of them, and I remember seeing some of the more recent ones and thinking those weren't that good. It's tough to find good adaptations of that, and maybe it's not something that really would lend itself well to a movie, and maybe something that would have to be done with like a streaming series. But it's hard to see how you could get a producer to be willing to take it as slow as this book is.
Well, yeah, the series seems to be like the format that would fit it best because it is a slow burn for most of the novel. It's atmospheric. It's trying to slowly build up this sense of something going wrong.
And now that audiences think they know what Dracula is about, they might not have patience.
That's true. Maybe you can't. Maybe it's been done so many times you can't really do something of this sort with it anymore. I don't know. I mean, it's interesting because we now have in the past, I guess the movie was sort of like the thing par excellence, and TV shows were they're seen as like being not as good, but now there's more potential. I mean, you think about some of the good sci-fi speculative fiction series that are out there in the present. Westworld, for example, the adaptation of Dick's Man in the High Castle, which granted they're way off book at this point, but it's pretty good stuff, There's so much more that you can do in that format. And it's different than TV used to be when we were younger, where a show came on once a week and they shot it, maybe in advance or maybe, that week, right? And that was what you got.
Well, with the ability to put out a show in its entire season all at once for somebody to binge watch as well, you don't have to have everybody remember, well, okay, what happened last week and where were we?
Yeah, you don't have to do the 3-minute recap at the beginning like they used to have to do.
So you can have an episode of a show which doesn't necessarily have like that beginning, middle, and an end in the same way that it would have done, say, back in the 90s, where each episode had to be sort of self-contained, even if it had an overall arc to it.
Yeah, that's quite true. And it's funny to watch old shows, which now don't seem quite as good in comparison. Maybe we've actually landed, this is totally outside of the realm of this, but maybe we've actually landed on a genre which is in some respects, superior to the other visual genres that we had available before. I don't know.
I think we have a lot more flexibility in terms of what we can do with television.
That's true, yeah. And movies can go straight to TV now without being seen as without being seen as like, oh well, it's one of those kind of just to DVD kind of movies, right? Yeah. As a matter of fact, Netflix, in order to try to win Academy Awards, had to find some theaters where they could like play one viewing of some of their movies.
To qualify.
Yeah.
Somebody, I think it was Martin Scorsese or somebody, was talking about some film he wanted to do called The Irishman or something along those lines.
Okay.
And said he went to like every major studio, every major movie studio with his idea. None of them were interested in it. And I think he was approached by, what was it, Amazon or Netflix or somebody who gave him $100 million and said, make the movie your way.
Oh, I
Wow.
think it's Amazon Prime.
Amazon.
Okay.
I think that's
And-
Amazon
I thought
Prime.
it's Netflix.
Or is it Netflix?
Yes, Netflix, because
Okay.
they're showing it at the theater for like
Oh, are
week,
they?
and then it's going to Netflix.
Well, and there was a big
Okay.
complaint about that. The theaters
Yeah.
wanted it for longer,
Right.
and then Netflix said no. Yeah.
Netflix already has a contract.
Oh,
This
interesting.
is the one where De Niro and Pesci, that they're all made to look younger and stuff, by some
CGI.
CGI.
I'm going to say something really mean.
Anti-aging.
Can they give De Niro back his talent then? Or-
I think he lost that somewhere after Heat.
I
Well,
mean,
it's interesting.
I don't know how Pesci is, but I was talking about this in class with some of my students today. We were talking about, there was a film class right before my class, and there's one kid who is in both classes. And so the teacher was there, and I said, what are you guys talking about? And he's talking about, oh, we're going to see The Graduate. And I said, oh, that's pretty cool. And I said, did he tell you about like the ending? And he's like, don't tell me about it. I haven't seen it yet. And so, I was like, yeah, it was really kind of interesting to see it. I mean, you think about Dustin Hoffman now, and you look at him when he was so young. And then he was talking about seeing Clint Eastwood when Clint Eastwood was really young. Because he only knows Clint Eastwood as this super, super old guy who's famous for like talking to the chair as being Obama and things like that. That's what his generation
Saw.
Yeah.
No, Rowdy
and
Yates,
then we were talking about other
Well,
actors.
go back to Rod.
I said Rowdy Yates.
Yeah. So like Hoffman's still a good actor, and Eastwood. I don't know. I haven't seen him lately, but things he did 10 years ago, he was still acting pretty well. But then I was like, yeah, and some actors, De Niro, Pacino, they were really great once, and now,
Well, they're all back in The Irishman, except
Are
looking
they?
a little younger,
Yeah.
doing the same damn thing with
Yeah.
Scorsese's doing. I mean, it's the same. Yeah, been here, seen that. And I think that's why it's getting to Netflix.
I wonder if Scorsese can get a better performance out of them, though, than somebody else would be able to do.
Well, it's interesting. This has nothing to do with philosophy.
Yeah.
When we're talking about film success,
Yeah.
there was just an article I read about Hallmark Christmas movies
Oh, yeah.
and why they are so successful.
Yeah.
Because it's the same formula over and over
Same
and
actors.
over.
movie.
Same actors. Same
actors.
actors.
Yeah.
The male leads
Well, what
were
is it then?
models that they hired.
Yeah.
Oh, really?
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's where they got most of their male
They
actors.
can't
from
act.
modeling
Oh.
agencies. Well, a few can act.
They
Okay.
say
They
just
hit a
stand
few,
there.
but the majority were hired just because they were good looking. But they were talking about why they're so successful compared to other television stations that tried to do something similar.
Like Lifetime, for example.
Like Lifetime or ABC. They say
Okay.
because people like to have a happy ending.
Yeah.
They film them in 3 weeks and spend no more than $2 million per film.
Okay.
Wow.
And they can churn them out.
They're total escapism.
They're-
And their total escape, their total positive escape, it's like,
So
everybody knows,
they're like the pulp of the time.
everybody
right?
knows they're a formula, everybody knows
Yeah.
it's gonna have a
Okay.
happy ending, but because they can churn them out at under $2 million a piece,
Yeah.
with actors that don't get paid a huge amount of money, and people just love them, and they're extremely successful every
A
year.
related
They're
note
running
of
them-
that
they run
is
those
that a
Christmas
lot of the
movies all year
talent that
long.
does
It's like-
Hallmark movies, the actors, the sound design, and everything also do direct to DVD horror movies.
Some of them do,
because
yes.
it's the same formula. You have to, or literally the same story formula, but you have to write them quick, act them quick, be competent but not too competent, be inexpensive.
Huh.
And
You
just
get an
give
occasional
got
actor
that
that
skill
crosses
set.
over
Okay.
from series
Maybe
television.
not the male
Okay.
You get a few. You get a few who cross over.
Well, interesting. Yeah.
But it's when you talk about success in film, it was kind of interesting
I mean,
analysis.
you know, you could. There've been so many to bring it back to Stoker and Dracula. There've been so many vampire things that at this point you could probably churn out like vampire formulaic story after story, and you could probably have a channel devoted to that. You know, sort of like that. At one time, they proposed having a Law and Order channel. I don't think they ever pulled it off, but there's enough content out there that you could easily fill up the airwaves with a cable channel that would just play Law and
I
Order.
think there is a digital channel. That
Is there really?
Pretty much Law and Order.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, you could probably do that with vampire stuff, I imagine. Maybe there is such a thing. I don't know. I haven't looked. I don't watch enough TV to.
Well,
look
there's
into that.
Comet TV, which is Twilight Zone, Outer Limits,
So speculative fiction
speculative,
stuff.
yeah,
Okay.
some of that kind of thing.
Can you get that on
And
yours?
sci-fi
No,
keeps churning out
it's,
more stuff.
digital.
Much of it of uneven
It's a digital
quality,
channel.
but you know,
Probably Hallmark actors when they're between films.
yeah. Well, what else is there to say about Dracula before we close then? Anything else? Or?
Well, you were asking, like, you know, do we get like a Dr. Seward figure in
Oh, yeah.
adaptations? Well, one thing I was thinking about and I mean, Stoker does a really good job with him, but with like the Jonathan Harker character, it reminds me of something else we were talking about films. Like one of the reasons why in many films, especially like adventure or SF films, like your primary protagonist is a little bit on the bland side a lot of the time compared to some of the people around. Like the reason why Luke Skywalker is a little bit less interesting than Han Solo, for instance, is because you as the viewer are meant to sort of project yourself onto them.
Okay.
That's your point of view character. That's the person you could sort of see yourself being, and so they aren't supposed to have too many personality quirks or be too kind of uniquely out there, because then they don't feel like somebody you could be anymore. They feel like themselves.
Yeah.
I feel like Jonathan Harker kind of fills that role in
character.
Dracula, where it's
Yeah.
sort of like you are here.
Well,
you are Jonathan Harker experiencing the character.
And you know what makes Jonathan Harker Jonathan Harker is he's been a victim.
Right.
Which
You know.
also, some people have noticed that might be why they don't adapt him into movies very often.
Because he was a victim?
Yeah, we can always do scantily clad women shrieking, being menaced by Dracula. It's
male
sexy
victim.
or whatever. But writing a male victim is still challenging for our culture.
Interesting,
Like,
yeah.
it's-
I suppose so.
Should have been the man might be victim.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that's a good place to end this. So thanks, everybody, for coming out and good conversation.